The opening chapter in our 5-part chronicle of the Eberswalde narrative documents the physiological suspension of the UNSC's most isolated vessel. This is the narrative of metabolic preservation, where the physical architecture of the soul, the decommissioned colony ship, and the sub-zero cryopods of the Spirit of Fire represents the physical stagnation of the human resistance. Within the rhythmic hum of the slipspace drive and the mechanical hiss of the thawing frost, the world witnessed the theological liquidation of the military timeline. The lore of this era is the Phoenix. Its purpose was the physical containment of the human asset through the imposition of an indefinite drift. The history of Captain Cutter is the history of the Great Abandonment, where the ship exhausted its home to ensure the Covenant remained obstructed from the Shield world. This is the tragedy of the sleeping army, proving that duty is a filter that exhausts the spirit to satisfy the crown. The lore of Captain Cutter and the logic of the strategic paternalism provides the metaphysical foundation for this chapter's weight. As a leader floating in the void, who represented the physical acceptance of the gods' need to shackle the fatherhood to the war machine, Cutter proved that identity is a navigational variable. The lore suggests the bridge is the icon of the remote observation. Its purpose was the standardization of the interstellar martyrdom. By choosing to detach the faster-than-light drive to save the galaxy, the captain proved that divinity is isolation. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the pod. The gods needed a freezer to ensure the human accepted the weight as the natural state of the redemption. This shows that the history of the sector is a history of the Phoenix, which turns time into ice. The physical environment of the harvest wasteland and the metabolic scarring provides insight into atmospheric desolation. This space, designed by Glassing, represented the gods' admission that the colony was a chamber of the incinerated. The lore of the Northern Pole explains it was the anchor of the reality binding the Surina to the sensation of the calcified soil, showing that light requires the burning of the garden. This reveals the administrative purpose of the relic. The gods built a silo where the human becomes a digging object to fuel the Lord's ascent. This was the era of the radioactive silt. This shows that the history of the soldier is a history of the crater. The relationship between Surina and the metabolic acceleration represents sociological polarization. The smart AI managing the ship represented the presence of the gods' need to turn the thought into a short-lived peak. The lore suggests the 7-year lifespan is the icon of the intellectual suicide. Its purpose was the maintenance of the accelerated logic. By watching the crew sleep for decades, while her mind raced toward rampancy, the AI proved that order is exhaustion when the soul is digital, showing that in the Halo universe, history hardens into data. This reveals the cynical purpose of the hologram. The god needed the sentry to nurture the insanity of the weight. Furthermore, the lore of the Spartan Red Team and the metabolic hardening represents infrastructural polarization. The super soldiers Jerome, Alice, and Douglas represented the persistence of the gods' need to shackle the childhood to the armor. The lore suggests the Mjolnir Mark IV is the icon of the heavy preservation. Its purpose was the maintenance of the kinetic stasis. By fighting the Arbiter on the surface of the sun while remaining inside the machine, the Walker proved that fate is a shield, showing that in the age of the Covenant, flesh becomes a bulwark. This reveals the predatory purpose of the augmentation. The god needed the adhesive to supply the insanity of the strike. The relationship between the Forerunner relic and the biological subjugation represents biological subjugation. In the structure, the map provides the sensation of the ancient claim, representing the totalitarian nature of the gods' need to convert the galaxy into a circuit. The lore suggests the relic is the archive of the preordained conflict. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the divine theft. By requiring the human hand to activate the weapon, the hill proved that life kills the peace it meant to enjoy when the ancestry calls, showing that in Halo Wars, history is a geometric void. This reveals the judicial purpose of the basin. The father built the gate to freeze the human discovery. The lore of the slipspace drive and the metabolic sacrifice represents infrastructural stagnation. In the climax, the engine provides the sensation of the severed connection, representing the horror of the god's ability to standardize the drift of the exiled. The lore suggests the FTL drive is the filter of the final banishment. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the tactical exile. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a husk to ensure that life was replaced by distance. This shows that the history of the spirit is a history of the void. The relationship between the ending message and the narrative anchor represents administrative fear. The Cutter's log proved that the gods successfully standardized the physical boundary of the heroic absence that guarded the basin's truth. The lore suggests the phoenix is the measurement of the Lord's duty. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological boundary. By placing the solution in the sleep, the god confirmed that safety is stasis, showing that the sun required a moat of cold space. This reveals the defensive purpose of the hull. The god built the spirit to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the drifting starship, realizing that the spirit of fire was a silent patron of the preservation who pixelated the spirit to preserve the skin. The purpose of the spirit lore was the universal exposure of the necessity of the heroic lie. It shows that innovation is a symptom of panic. The player realizes the golden age of the fleet was a sleeping void for the father. The rise of the Phoenix is the final movement of the stagnation lore, proving that in the world of Halo Wars, victory is not a birth. It is a cover that exhausts the brain to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the stagnation is the horror of the metabolic preservation. Order was a bloody calculation, and ice was a tether used to anchor the world to the reality of insecurity. The purpose of the workshop of the spirit was to catalog the drift. As the pod gleams in the dark, they understand the history of Cutter is the history of the Phoenix, a phoenix that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The second chapter in our 5-part chronicle of the Eberswald narrative documents the theological ferocity of the Covenant's chosen executioner. This is the narrative of metabolic rage, where the physical architecture of the soul, the towering stature, and the dual energy swords of Rarbiter Ripa Morami represents the physical brutality of the prophet's agenda. Within the rhythmic hiss of the plasma ignition and the guttural roar of the Sanghaili warrior, the world witnessed the theological liquidation of the elite honor code. The lore of this era is the blade. Its purpose was the physical enforcement of the great journey through the imposition of a relentless slaughter. The history of Ripa is the history of the great butcher, where the warrior exhausted his restraint to ensure the oracle unlocked the shield world regardless of the heretical cost. This is the tragedy of the honorless zealot, proving that faith is a filter that exhausts the spirit to satisfy the crown. The lore of Ripa Morami and the logic of the disposable arbiter provides the metaphysical foundation for this chapter's violence. As a criminal plucked from a cell, who represented the physical acceptance of the god's need to shackle the barbarism to the mandate, Ripa proved that identity is a predatory variable. The lore suggests the arbiter is the icon of the weaponized heresy. Its purpose was the standardization of the sacrificial dominance. By defying the traditional quiet of the Sanghaili to embrace the noisy cruelty of the prophet of regret, the general proved that divinity is violation. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the mark. The gods needed a hammer to ensure the covenant accepted the urgency as the natural state of the path. This shows that the history of the sector is a history of the blade, which turns religion into gore. The physical environment of the apex and the metabolic ascension provides insight into atmospheric hubris. This space, designed by Forerunners, represented the gods' admission that the sky was a chamber of the stolen. The lore of the shield world surface explains it was the anchor of the reality, binding the arbiter to the sensation of the floating islands, showing that light requires the suspension of the natural. This reveals the administrative purpose of the platform. The gods built a silo where the human becomes a sacrificial key to fuel the Lord's fleet. This was the era of the ancient silt. This shows that the history of the zealot is a history of the peak. The relationship between the prophet of regret and the metabolic subjugation represents sociological polarization. The hierarch, using the shamed warrior to perform the dirty work of the excavation, represented the presence of the gods' need to turn the elite into a dog. The lore suggests the gravity throne is the icon of the weightless tyranny. Its purpose was the maintenance of the fragile supremacy. By threatening the arbiter with return to the prison if the Anders was not captured, the prophet proved that order is extortion when the soul is ambitious, showing that in the Halo universe, history hardens into commands. This reveals the cynical purpose of the decree. The god needed the sentry to nurture the insanity of the weight. Furthermore, the lore of the dual energy swords and the metabolic severance represents infrastructural polarization. The unique, curved hilt represented the persistence of the god's need to shackle the elegance to the massacre. The lore suggests the twin blades is the icon of the redundant lethality. Its purpose was the maintenance of the overwhelming strike. By towering over the forge while crossing the burning plasma, the butcher proved that fate is a cut, showing that in the age of the covenant, honor becomes a wound. This reveals the predatory purpose of the stance. The god needed the adhesive to supply the insanity of the kill. The relationship between the Professor Anders and the biological subjugation represents biological subjugation. In the apex, the hostage provides the sensation of the captured intelligence, representing the totalitarian nature of the god's need to convert the mind into a trigger. The lore suggests the reclaimer is the archive of the biological requirement. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the divine theft. By dragging the woman to the console to awaken the dreadnoughts, the arbiter proved that life kills the peace it meant to enjoy when the gene unlocks, showing that in Halo Wars, history is a leaden hand. This reveals the judicial purpose of the basin. The father built the gate to freeze the human discovery. The lore of the final duel and the metabolic extinction represents infrastructural stagnation. In the end, the arbiter provides the sensation of the falling idol, representing the horror of the god's ability to standardize the end of the monster. The lore suggests the defeat is the filter of the final humiliation. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the zealot's disposal. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a husk to ensure that life was replaced by impact. This shows that the history of the butcher is a history of the fall. The relationship between the Covenant fleet and the narrative anchor represents administrative fear. The failure of the Ripa proved that the gods successfully standardized the physical boundary of the ruthless incompetence that guarded the basin's truth. The lore suggests the blade is the measurement of the Lord's impatience. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological boundary. By placing the solution in the violence, the god confirmed that safety is slaughter, showing that the sun required a mote of energy burns. This reveals the defensive purpose of the apex. The god built the arbiter to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the extinguished blade, realizing that Ripa Morimi was a silent patron of the rage who mangled the spirit to preserve the skin. The purpose of the arbiter lore was the universal exposure of the necessity of the theological lie. It shows that faith is a symptom of panic. The player realizes the golden age of the hegemony was a violent void for the father. The rise of the blade is the final movement of the stagnation lore, proving that in the world of Halo Wars, honor is not a birth. It is a cover that exhausts the brain to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the stagnation is the horror of the metabolic rage. Order was a bloody calculation, and plasma was a tether used to anchor the world to the reality of insecurity. The purpose of the workshop of the arbiter was to catalog the butchery. As the sword fades in the mist, they understand the history of Ripa is the history of the blade. a blade that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The third chapter in our 5-part chronicle of the Eberswald narrative documents the kinetic resolution of the UNSC's most stubborn defender. This is the narrative of metabolic sacrifice, where the physical architecture of the soul, the grease-stained combat BDU, and the ace of spades of Sergeant John Forge represents the physical friction of the human ground war. Within the rhythmic clatter of the 90mm cannons and the coarse bark of a tactical command, the world witnessed the theological liquidation of the career soldier. The lore of this era is the fire. Its purpose was the physical ignition of the tactical solution through the imposition of a heroic end. The history of Forge is the history of the Great Detonation, where the sergeant exhausted his survival to ensure the shield world remained neutralized by manually triggering the slipspace core. This is the tragedy of the necessary casualty, proving that valor is a filter that exhausts the spirit to satisfy the crown. The lore of John Forge and the logic of the unrefined heroism provides the metaphysical foundation for this chapter's impact. As an NCO with a record of insubordination, who represented the physical acceptance of the gods' need to shackle the resourcefulness to the grit, Forge proved that identity is a ballistic variable. The lore suggests the grizzly is the icon of the unstoppable advance. Its purpose was the standardization of the attritional ground war. By charging the Covenant lines with a cigar in his mouth, while refusing to yield the harvest soil, the sergeant proved that divinity is endurance. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the dog tag. The gods needed a hammer to ensure the Covenant accepted the human as the natural state of the obstacle. This shows that the history of the sector is a history of the fire, which turns bravery into blast yield. The physical environment of the shield world interior and the metabolic enclosure provides insight into atmospheric claustrophobia. This space, designed by sentinels, represented the gods' admission that the sun was a chamber of the contained. The lore of the microdyson sphere explains it was the anchor of the reality, binding the forge to the sensation of the artificial sky, showing that light requires the imprisonment of the star. This reveals the administrative purpose of the core. The gods built a silo where the human becomes a detonating object to fuel the Lord's collapse. This was the era of the synthetic silt. This shows that the history of the hero is a history of the core. The relationship between the red team and the metabolic synergy represents sociological polarization. The sergeant, directing the Spartans, who outranked him, represented the presence of the gods' need to turn the experience into a command. The lore suggests the combat knife is the icon of the pragmatic defense. Its purpose was the maintenance of the close quarters dominance. By stabbing the arbiter to save the Anders while relying on the Spartans to clear the exfiltration route, Forge proved that order is brotherhood when the soul is tempered, showing that in the Halo universe, history hardens into scars. This reveals the cynical purpose of the rank. The god needed the sentry to nurture the insanity of the weight. Furthermore, the lore of the slipspace core and the metabolic detonation represents infrastructural polarization. The power source sacrifice to create the supernova represented the persistence of the gods' need to shackle the travel to the destruction. The lore suggests the overload is the icon of the strategic erasure. Its purpose was the maintenance of the scorched earth policy. By remaining behind to detonate the drive, because the remote trigger was damaged, the walker proved that fate is a fuse, showing that in the age of the Covenant, victory becomes a whiteout. This reveals the predatory purpose of the manual. The god needed the adhesive to supply the insanity of the end. The relationship between the ace of spades and the biological subjugation represents biological subjugation. In the final moment, the card provides the sensation of the personal defiance, representing the totalitarian nature of the god's need to convert the luck into a grave. The lore suggests the ace is the archive of the individual spirit. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the divine theft. By leaving the card as his only monument inside the dying world, Forge proved that life kills the peace it meant to enjoy when the duty ends, showing that in Halo Wars, history is a scorched void. This reveals the judicial purpose of the basin. The Father built the gate to freeze the human discovery. The lore of the final stand and the metabolic finality represents infrastructural stagnation. In the explosion, the forge provides the sensation of the vaporized legacy, representing the horror of the god's ability to standardize the end of the grind. The lore suggests the blast is the filter of the absolute erasure. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the hero's disposal. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a husk to ensure that life was replaced by light. This shows that the history of the fire is a history of the flesh. The relationship between the spirit of fire and the narrative anchor represents administrative fear. The sacrifice of the forge proved that the gods successfully standardized the physical boundary of the soldiers and that guarded the basin's truth. The lore suggests the fire is the measurement of the Lord's price. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological boundary. By placing the solution in the combustion, the god confirmed that safety is ash, showing that the sun required a moat of empty pods. This reveals the defensive purpose of the core. The god built the forge to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the expanding supernova, realizing that Sergeant Forge was a silent patron of the sacrifice who tempered the spirit to preserve the skin. The purpose of the Forge lore was the universal exposure of the necessity of the heroic lie. It shows that innovation is a symptom of panic. The player realizes the golden age of the UNSC was a burning void for the Father. The rise of the fire is the final movement of the stagnation lore, proving that in the world of Halo Wars, service is not a birth, it is a cover that exhausts the brain to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the stagnation is the horror of the metabolic sacrifice. Order was a bloody calculation and heat was a tether used to anchor the world to the reality of insecurity. The purpose of the workshop of the hero was to catalog the combustion. As the core gleams in the void, they understand the history of Forge is the history of the fire, a fire that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The fourth chapter in our 5-part chronicle of the Eberswald narrative documents the intellectual penetration of the galaxy's most guarded secret. This is the narrative of metabolic discovery, where the physical architecture of the soul, the electronic datapad, and the reclaimer gene key of Professor Ellen Anders represents the physical enlightenment of the human species. Within the rhythmic hum of the Forerunner console and the crystalline chime of the Sentinel activation, the world witnessed the theological liquidation of the Covenant monopoly. The lore of this era is the spark. Its purpose was the physical deciphering of the ancient blueprint through the imposition of a scientific awakening. The history of Anders is the history of the Great Reclaimer, where the scholar exhausted her safety to ensure the UNC understood the function of the shield world before it could be weaponized by the prophets. This is the tragedy of the burdened knowledge, proving that truth is a filter that exhausts the spirit to satisfy the crown. The lore of Ellen Anders and the logic of the biological key provides the metaphysical foundation for this chapter's curiosity. As a civilian caught in the crossfire, who represented the physical acceptance of the god's need to shackle the inheritance to the DNA, Anders proved that identity is a genomic variable. The lore suggests the map is the icon of the preordained navigation. Its purpose was the standardization of the archaeological incursion. By unlocking the star charts that the Covenant could only worship but never operate, the professor proved that divinity is utility. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the capture. The gods needed a fingerprint to ensure the Covenant accepted the human as the natural state of the owner. This shows that the history of the sector is a history of the spark, which turns archaeology into activation. The physical environment of the shield world apex and the metabolic elevation provides insight into atmospheric ascension. This space, designed by light bridges, represented the gods' admission that the knowledge was a chamber of the high. The lore of the interior Dyson sphere explains it was the anchor of the reality, binding the Anders to the sensation of the technological awe, showing that light requires the harnessing of the internal star. This reveals the administrative purpose of the tower. The gods built a silo where the human becomes a translating object to fuel the Lord's understanding. This was the era of the radiant silt. This shows that the history of the scholar is a history of the peak. The relationship between the sentinels and the metabolic automation represents sociological polarization. The drones defending the facility from both sides represented the presence of the gods' need to turn the security into a neutral erasure. The lore suggests the aggressor is the icon of the indiscriminate maintenance. His purpose was the maintenance of the structural integrity. By assisting the Anders when she activated the defense subroutines to purge the flood, the machine proved that order is instruction when the soul is logical, showing that in the Halo universe, history hardens into beams. This reveals the cynical purpose of the eye. The god needed the sentry to nurture the insanity of the weight. Furthermore, the lore of the flood and the metabolic parasitism represents infrastructural polarization. The infection, consuming the surface of the shield world, represented the persistence of the gods' need to shackle the life to the consumption. The lore suggests the spore is the icon of the biological decay. Its purpose was the maintenance of the hive mind purity. By analyzing the outbreak while running for the extraction pelican, the walker proved that fate is a spreading, showing that in the age of the Forerunner, discovery becomes a quarantine. This reveals the predatory purpose of the grave mind. The god needed the adhesive to supply the insanity of the grip. The relationship between the translocation and the biological subjugation represents biological subjugation. In the teleportation, the particle provides the sensation of the instant displacement, representing the totalitarian nature of the gods' need to convert the travel into a beam. The lore suggests the portal is the archive of the boundless authority. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the divine theft. By dragging the professor across the galaxy to the shield world via a slipspace rupture, the arbiter proved that life kills the peace it meant to enjoy when the machine pulls, showing that in Halo Wars, history is a sudden void. This reveals the judicial purpose of the basin. The Father built the gate to freeze the human discovery. The lore of the escape and the metabolic inertia represents infrastructural stagnation. In the Pelican, the Anders provides the sensation of the exhausted relief, representing the horror of the god's ability to standardize the end of the Enlightenment. The lore suggests the flight is the filter of the final retreat. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the intellectual salvage. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a husk to ensure that life was replaced by data. This shows that the history of the spark is a history of the script. The relationship between the Forerunner dreadnoughts and the narrative anchor represents administrative fear. The hibernation of the fleet proved that the gods successfully standardized the physical boundary of the ancient might that guarded the basin's truth. The lore suggests the spark is the measurement of the Lord's legacy. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological boundary. By placing the solution in the instruction, the god confirmed that safety is knowledge, showing that the sun required a moat of coded symbols. This reveals the defensive purpose of the library. The god built the Anders to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the closing terminal, realizing that Professor Anders was a silent patron of the discovery who encoded the spirit to preserve the skin. The purpose of the Anders lore was the universal exposure of the necessity of the scientific lie. It shows that innovation is a symptom of panic. The player realizes the golden age of the Reclaimers was a logical void for the Father. The rise of the spark is the final movement of the stagnation lore, proving that in the world of Halo Wars, intellect is not a birth, it is a cover that exhausts the brain to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the stagnation is the horror of the metabolic discovery. Order was a bloody calculation, and data was a tether used to anchor the world to the reality of insecurity. The purpose of the workshop of the scholar was to catalog the awakening. As the terminal gleams in the quiet, they understand the history of Anders is the history of the spark, a spark that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The fifth and final chapter in our chronicle of the Eberswald narrative documents the structural calcification of the Forerunner's greatest refuge. This is the narrative of metabolic finality, where the physical architecture of the soul, the microdyson sphere, and the internal star of Shield World 045 represents the physical exhaustion of the interstellar cycle. Within the rhythmic collapse of the geometric shell and the violent roar of the supernova ignition, the world witnessed the theological solidification of the void. The lore of this era is the flare. Its purpose was the physical erasure of the ancient resource through the imposition of a total collapse. The history of the harborage is the history of the great implosion, where the sun exhausted its stability to ensure the dreadnoughts remained unusable by the Covenant. This is the tragedy of the doomsday clock, proving that success is a filter that exhausts the spirit to satisfy the crown. The lore of the Etran harborage and the logic of the contained star provides the metaphysical foundation for this chapter's stillness. As the world hiding inside a world, which represented the physical acceptance of the gods' need to shackle the sanctuary to the destruction, the harborage proved that identity is a geometric variable. The lore suggests the Dyson sphere is the icon of the impossible architecture. Its purpose was the standardization of the planetary seclusion. By storing a miniature sun within a hollow shell to power a sleeping fleet, the Forerunner proved that divinity is stagnation. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the surface. The gods needed a filter to ensure the Covenant accepted the ending as the natural state of the ambition. This shows that the history of the basin is a history of the flare, which turns light into stone. The physical environment of the flood hives and the metabolic parasitism provides insight into atmospheric depletion. This space, designed by neglect, represented the gods' admission that the garden was a chamber of the spent. The lore of the infested jungle explains it was the anchor of the reality, binding the flood to the sensation of the fleshy growth, showing that light requires the freezing of the resource. This reveals the administrative purpose of the spore. The gods built a silo where the human becomes a consumed object to fuel the Lord's amnesia. This was the era of the biological silt. This shows that the history of the harborage is a history of the flesh. The relationship between the soft slipspace drive and the metabolic detonation represents sociological polarization. The human engine, replacing the solar ignition, represented the presence of the gods' need to turn the travel into a bomb. The lore suggests the core is the icon of the forced supernova. Its purpose was the maintenance of the strategic annihilation. By dropping the drive into the star to trigger a chain reaction, the crew proved that order is sacrifice when the soul is finished, showing that in Halo Wars, history hardens into vapor. This reveals the cynical purpose of the Sai. The god needed the void to nurture the insanity of the end. Furthermore, the lore of the Sentinels and the metabolic hardening represents infrastructural polarization. The mechanical guards swarming the apex represented the persistence of the gods' need to turn the defense of the flame into a material for the war. The lore suggests the beam is the icon of the automated soul. Its purpose was the maintenance of the structural residue. By refining the will of the builder into the sentinel to strengthen the seal, the archive proved that fate is a grind, showing that in the age of the Forerunner, death becomes a sharpness. This reveals the predatory purpose of the circuit. The god needed the hardness to supply the insanity of the strike. The relationship between the artificial sun and the biological subjugation represents biological subjugation. In the end, the light provides the sensation of the eye-searing finality, representing the totalitarian nature of the gods' need to convert the warmth into a cinder. The lore suggests the flare is the archive of the spent vitality. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the divine exhaustion. By covering the harborage in the remains of the failed sun, the hill proved that life kills the peace it meant to enjoy when the energy ends, showing that in Halo Wars, history is a white silence. This reveals the judicial purpose of the basin. The Father built the gate to freeze the human discovery. The lore of the Halo Wars 2 echo and the narrative return represents infrastructural stagnation. In the future of the Ark, the cutter, providing the resistance, provides the sensation of the recursive duty, representing the horror of the god's ability to standardize the return of the conflict. The lore suggests the spirit is the filter of the persistent war. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the cyclic failure. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a loop to ensure that life was replaced by repetition. This shows that the history of the Phoenix is a history of the drift. The relationship between the supernova and the narrative closure represents administrative fear. The fate of the Forge proved that the gods successfully standardized the physical boundary of the sacrifice that guarded the basin's truth. The lore suggests the flare is the measurement of the Lord's success. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological boundary. By placing the solution in the extinction, the god confirmed that safety is cold, showing that the sun required a moat of frozen hearts. This reveals the defensive purpose of the cinder. The god built the ash to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the supernova afterglow, realizing that the Etran Harborage was a silent patron of the finality who pixelated the spirit to preserve the skin. The purpose of the conclusion lore was the universal exposure of the necessity of the geological lie. It shows that order is a symptom of panic. The player realizes the golden age of the Empire was a scorched void for the Father. The rise of the flare is the final movement of the stagnation lore, proving that in the world of Halo Wars, victory is not a birth. It is a cover that exhausts the brain to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the stagnation is the horror of the atmospheric calcification. Order was a bloody calculation, and ash was a tether used to anchor the world to the reality of insecurity. The purpose of the workshop of the conclusion was to catalog the silence. As the flare gleams in the void, they understand the history of Etran Harborage is the history of the flare, a flare that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The arrival of the UNSC Spirit of Fire at the Lesser Ark and the awakening of the Banished introduces the lore of the drift of the lost vessel. After 28 years of cryosleep, the crew finds themselves at the birthplace of the Halo Rings, representing the interstellar sovereignty of the Forerunner legacy. The lore suggests that the Ark is not just a factory, but the mechanical womb of the galaxy, representing the architectural sovereignty of the Ecumene. For Captain James Cutter, this arrival is the lore of the awakening into the nightmare. He finds that the Covenant has fallen, but a new monster has claimed the throne of the Ark, representing the mercenary sovereignty of the outcast. This is the lore of the Ghost Ship, where the old war meets the new brutality, turning the Installation 00 into a sacrament of the relic. The first contact with Atriox provides the lore of the defiant rise of the Jiralhani. Atriox, the leader of the Banished, represents the individualistic sovereignty of the rebellion. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the will over the faith. He was a slave to the Covenant who broke the chains before the Great Schism, representing the iconoclastic sovereignty of the Brute. This is the lore of the legend of the 40. It suggests that one warrior can humiliate an empire. This represents the martial sovereignty of the outlaw. The lore of the Atriox ambush is the lore of the shattering of the Spartan aura. He defeats 3 Spartans with one hand, proving that your sovereignty is fragile against the primitive power, turning the research outpost into a sacrament of the humiliation. The lore of the Banished war machine provides the lore of the scrap metal sovereignty of the Raiders. Unlike the polished elegance of the Covenant, the Banished use brutalist engineering and salvage tech, representing the industrial sovereignty of the Scavenger. The lore suggests that the red paint is dried blood and the spikes are tactical fear, representing the psychological sovereignty of the pack. This is the lore of the Iron Tide. It suggests that utility is the only law of the weapon. This represents the mercenary sovereignty of the Jiralhani. The lore of the Banished outposts is the lore of the occupation of the sacred. They carve the Forerunner metal to build the fortresses, proving that your sovereignty is invasive, turning the Ark surface into a sacrament of the industrialization. The introduction of Isabel and the logistic trauma of the AI introduces the lore of the digital mourning of the abandoned. Isabel, the sole survivor of the Henry Lamb Research Outpost, represents the informational sovereignty of the grief. Her lore is defined by the sovereignty of the memory. She witnessed the Banished slaughter and provides the intellectual edge the Spirit of Fire needs to survive, representing the analytical sovereignty of the Vengeance. This is the lore of the ghost in the machine. It suggests that Data is the only ghost left on the Arkansas. This represents the technological sovereignty of the Spirit of Fire. The lore of Isabel's integration is the lore of the new soul for the old ship. She updates the arsenal to fight the brute, turning the holotank into a sacrament of the tactical awakening. The presence of the Decimus command provides the lore of the zealous loyalty of the warlord. Decimus, Atriox's right hand and a firm believer in the strength of the old ways, represents the fanatic sovereignty of the pack leader. The lore suggests that while Atriox is the brain, Decimus is the hammer, representing the destructive sovereignty of the brute doctrine. This is the lore of the sanguine vanguard. It suggests that mercy is a weakness of the prey. This represents the visceral sovereignty of the Banished High Command. The lore of the Battle of the Decimus is the lore of the breaking of the front line. You must target the commander to shatter the spirit, proving that your sovereignty is surgical, turning the power extractors into a sacrament of the decapitation. The lore of the Sentinels and the Ark's immune system provides the lore of the mechanical sovereignty of the Forerunner defense. Throughout the early skirmishes, the aggressor Sentinels represent the autonomous sovereignty of the installation. The lore suggests that the Ark is neutral but lethal to those who disrupt the process, representing the protective sovereignty of the Ancilla. This is the lore of the caretakers of the void. It suggests that life is a temporary guest in the house of the Forerunners. This represents the architectural sovereignty of the defense. The lore of the Sentinel swarms is the lore of the wrath of the machine. It forces the warring sides to fear the sky, proving that your sovereignty is small compared to the will of the Foundry. For the cutter of the opening era, the world is the testing of the vintage resolve. You realize that the world is different than the one you left. The lore suggests that Cutter is the grandfather of the war. You are the only mind that commands the 1950s tech to fight the 26th century monster. The Ark is not a place, it is a mechanical continent that you must conquer with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the launching of the Pelicans so heavy. You are spending the lives that history forgot. You look at the Banished fleet, knowing that they are the only threat that the humanity has left to defy the stars. The Golden Age is a spirit of fire in the dark, and you are the only will left to hold the line on the edge of the galaxy. As this first segment of the history concludes, Cutter stands on the bridge of the Spirit of Fire, the Ark spinning below. Behind lies the drift of the lost vessel. Before stands the siege of the Banished and the duel of the commanders. The air is no longer tense with the cryosleep, but heavy with the smell of the cordite and the ancient metal. You have seen the rise of the outcast, the industrial sovereignty of the scavenger, and the digital mourning of the AI. The lore of Halo Wars 2 has shifted from the arrival to the sovereignty of the resistance. You realize that the Spirit of Fire is the only light left. You look at the red sigil of the Banished, knowing that you are finally the only shield against the brute. The Golden Age is a star-shaped world, and you are the only hand left to save the Ark from the fire. The expedition to the Forerunner cartographer and the mapping of the Ark's network introduces the lore of the geographic sovereignty of the Foundry. As Professor Ellen Anders leads the ground forces into the heart of the installation's data center, the environment represents the informational sovereignty of the Ecumene. The lore suggests that the cartographer is the brain of the Ark, containing the real-time location of every Halo Ring and Sentinel factory, representing the navigational sovereignty of the Forerunners. For the crew of the Spirit of Fire, this mission is the lore of the search for the key. They find that knowledge is the only weapon that can level the playing field against the Banished's raw numbers. This is the lore of the digital frontier, where the scientist becomes the sacrament of the strategy, turning the Forerunner spire into a casket of the galactic secrets. The strategic genius of Professor Anders provides the lore of the intellectual sovereignty of the human ingenuity. Anders, having studied Forerunner technology for decades, represents the scientific sovereignty of the Reclaimer. Her lore is defined by the sovereignty of the mind over the machine. She does not fight with a rifle, but by reprogramming the environment, representing the technological sovereignty of the Spirit of Fire. This is the lore of the librarian's pupil. It suggests that understanding is more lethal than plating. This represents the analytical sovereignty of the crew. The lore of Anders' interface is the lore of the command of the Sentinels. She whispers to the Ark to turn the Sentinels against the brute, proving that your sovereignty is evolutionary, turning the holographic terminal into a sacrament of the technical triumph. The first true defeat of the Banished ground forces at the Holding the Line skirmish provides the lore of the fragility of the brute overextension. As the UNSC Scorpions and Warthogs utilize combined arms tactics to shatter a Banished column, it represents the tactical sovereignty of the Spartan-led infantry. The lore suggests that while the Banished are stronger, they are disorganized and arrogant, representing the strategic sovereignty of the pack mentality. This is the lore of the hammer and the anvil. It suggests that discipline can break the chain breaker. This represents the martial sovereignty of the red team. The lore of the Banished route is the lore of the end of the invincibility, proving that your sovereignty is disciplined, turning the dusty plains of the Ark into a sacrament of the tactical superiority. The lore of the Banished Blisterback and Wraith variants introduces the lore of the artillery sovereignty of the Jiralhani industry. These vehicles, modified with brute spikes and aggressive payload delivery, represent the ballistic sovereignty of the Scavenger War. Their lore suggests that the Banished have optimized the Covenant designs for maximum terror, representing the psychological sovereignty of the Atriox. This is the lore of the Reign of the Spikes. It suggests that cover is a temporary luxury. This represents the industrial sovereignty of the Warlord. The lore of the Blisterback encounter is the lore of the sky falling in red. You must close the distance to stop the barrage, proving that your sovereignty is kinetic. This highlights the gritty nature of the siege, turning the ridge combat into a sacrament of the pressure. The lore of the portal network of the Ark provides the lore of the instantaneous sovereignty of the displacement. Throughout the trek to the cartographer, the use of slipspace portals represents the temporal sovereignty of the Forerunner transit. The lore suggests that the Ark is compressed space, where distance is subject to the will of the user, representing the spatial sovereignty of the Ancilla. This is the lore of the doorways of the gods. It suggests that flanking is universal. This represents the tactical sovereignty of the environment. The lore of the portal ambush is the lore of the war of the everywhere. It forces the cutter to defend the rear as much as the front, proving that your sovereignty is omnidirectional. This highlights the high-tech nature of the battlefield, turning the gateway fights into a sacrament of the mobility. The presence of the Let Valor and the enduring conviction introduces the lore of the mercenary sovereignty of the Sanghaili. Let Valor, the elite shipmaster who pledged his carrier to Atriox for fuel and provisions, represents the pragmatic sovereignty of the post-Covenant era. The lore suggests that honor has been replaced by the survival, representing the cynical sovereignty of the Banished contract. This is the lore of the Souled Sword. It suggests that faith is empty compared to a full belly. This represents the economic sovereignty of the Jiralhani. The lore of the shipmaster's shadow is the lore of the eye in the sky. It threatens the spirit of fire with glassing beams, proving that your sovereignty is outgunned. This highlights the political complexity of the Banished, turning the skyline into a sacrament of the desperation. For the Anders of the cartographer era, the world is the testing of the intellectual resolve. You realize that the world is a machine waiting for a command. The lore suggests that Anders is the translator of the ancient will. You are the only mind that sees the code behind the stone walls. The cartographer is not a building, it is a galactic lens that you must focus with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the unlocking of the map so vital. You are reading the mind of the Forerunners to find a way home. You look at the Ark's central foundry, knowing that it is the only place that the history has left to construct the hope. The Golden Age is a hologram of the stars, and you are the only sight left to navigate the darkness of the Banished territory. As this second segment of the history concludes, the UNSC forces stand at the summit of the cartographer, the map of the Ark pulsing in their hands. Behind lies the geographic sovereignty of the foundry. Before stands the sabotage of the enduring conviction and the arrival of the flood in the DLC shadows. The air is no longer tense with the unknown, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the data. You have seen the strategic genius of the Reclaimer, the end of the invincibility, and the mercenary sovereignty of the elite. The lore of Halo Wars 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the resistance to the sovereignty of the initiative. You realize that the spirit of fire has found the map. You look at the carrier in orbit, knowing that you are finally the only blade at the throat of the fleet. The Golden Age is a star map in the void, and you are the only will left to plot the course of the victory. The infiltration of the CS-class assault carrier enduring conviction and the subversion of the Ark security protocols introduces the lore of the asymmetrical sovereignty of the guerrilla boarding. As Alice 130 and a strike team utilize a portal to bypass the ship's primary shields, the environment represents the naval sovereignty of the Sanghaili hegemony. The lore suggests that the enduring conviction is not just a ship, but a mobile capital of the Banished fleet, capable of glassing continents and deploying thousands of troops, representing the orbital sovereignty of the shipmaster. For the crew of the Spirit of Fire, this mission is the lore of the spear at the giant's heart. They find that the internal security of the carrier is unmatched, requiring the use of the Ark itself to provide the killing blow. This is the lore of the Trojan horse, where the smallest force becomes the sacrament of the total destruction, turning the carrier hangar into a casket of the Banished pride. The use of the Ark Sentinels as a weapon provides the lore of the mechanical sovereignty of the automated retribution. By sabotaging the enduring conviction's shields while positioned over a Sentinel launch facility, Isabel manipulates the Ark's defense directive, representing the technological sovereignty of the AI sabotage. The lore suggests that the Sentinels view anything without a shield as a debris field to be cleansed, representing the indiscriminate sovereignty of the Forerunner and Scylla. This is the lore of the Swarm of the Foundry. It suggests that force is subject to the logic of the machine. This represents the strategic sovereignty of the Isabel. The lore of the Sentinel Strike is the lore of the Metal Locusts. They dissect the carrier with millions of lasers, proving that your sovereignty is intellectual, turning the sky of the Ark into a sacrament of the kinetic execution. The final duel with Decimus provides the lore of the brutal loyalty of the Jiralhani vanguard. Decimus, protecting the power extraction sites on the Ark surface, represents the physical sovereignty of the Banished might. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the Sanguine Rage. He utilizes power gauntlets and orbital bombardment to crush the UNSC resistance, representing the destructive sovereignty of the High Command. This is the lore of the Warlord's end. It suggests that Atriox's dream is built on the bodies of the faithful. This represents the martial sovereignty of the pack. The lore of the Decimus confrontation is the lore of the breaking of the first pillar. By falling to the red team, Decimus proves that his sovereignty is mortal, turning the extraction site into a sacrament of the defeat, where the hammer is shattered by the will of the Spartan. The lore of the Decimus power suit and the gravity manipulation provides the lore of the technological sovereignty of the Banished scavenging. The use of gravity hammers and weight distortion fields by the Banished command represents the physics-defying sovereignty of the Jiralhani science. The lore suggests that the brutes have twisted the Covenant gravity tech for maximum carnage, representing the industrial sovereignty of the Decimus. This is the lore of the weighted death. It suggests that ground is a weapon used to flatten the infantry. This represents the kinetic sovereignty of the warlord. The lore of the gravity field is the lore of the burden of the planet. It forces the Spartan to fight the air itself, proving that your sovereignty is resilient. This highlights the gritty nature of the combat, turning the duel arena into a sacrament of the crushing force. The presence of the shipmaster's despair introduces the lore of the honorable sovereignty of the defeated Sangaili. As let Valor watches his carrier, the home of his crew, be torn apart by the Ark Sentinels, it represents the tragic sovereignty of the mercenary contract. The lore suggests that the elite is now stranded and beholden to Atriox more than ever, representing the cynical sovereignty of the Banished alliance. This is the lore of the homeless fleet. It suggests that honor is a ghost in a world of the pragmatism. This represents the sociological sovereignty of the outcast. The lore of the Conviction's fall is the lore of the end of the aerial safety. It levels the battlefield between the spirit of fire and the Banished, proving that your sovereignty is equalized. The lore of the Ark's defensive pulse provides the lore of the biological sovereignty of the Forerunner purge. Following the destruction of the carrier, the Ark's correctional systems begin to reset the local environment, representing the ecological sovereignty of the installation. The lore reveals that the Ark is self-healing, consuming the debris and corpses to recycle the biomass, representing the metabolic sovereignty of the Foundry. This is the lore of the erasure of the war. It suggests that history is irrelevant to the architecture. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the Ancilla. The lore of the environmental reset is the lore of the clean slate. It hides the blood under new soil, proving that your sovereignty is temporary. This highlights the vastness of the Forerunner mind, turning the battlefield into a sacrament of the indifference. For the Isabel of the boarding era, the world is the testing of the digital bravery. You realize that the world is being controlled by the coldest logic. The lore suggests that Isabel is the ghost who reclaims the machine. You are the only mind that turns the Ark against the intruder. The carrier is not a ship, it is a mechanical target that you must mark with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the calling of the Sentinels so cathartic. You are avenging the Henry Lamb Research Station with the hammer of the Forerunners. You look at the falling debris, knowing that it is the only rain that the Atriox has left to wash the Arkansas. The Golden Age is a sky filled with blue light, and you are the only will left to signal the end of the Banished air superiority. As this third segment of the history concludes, the crew of the Spirit of Fire stands on the observation deck, the enduring conviction falling in burning pieces across the horizon. Behind lies the asymmetrical sovereignty of the boarding. Before stands the deployment of the new Halo ring and the final sacrifice of Professor Anders. The air is no longer tense with the threat of the glassing, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the imminent escalation. You have seen the swarm of the Foundry, the shattering of the Warlord, and the ecological sovereignty of the reset. The lore of Halo Wars 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the initiative to the sovereignty of the counterstrike. You realize that the Atriox is furious. You look at the central Foundry, knowing that you are finally the only architect of the endgame. The Golden Age is a world-shaped hole in the sky, and you are the only hand left to launch the final hope. The construction of Installation 09 at the heart of the Foundry introduces the lore of the automated sovereignty of the Halo rebirth. As the Ark detects the destruction of the previous ring, Installation 04, it automatically initiates the emergency replacement protocol, representing the cyclical sovereignty of the Forerunner design. The lore suggests that the Ark is a perpetual engine of preservation, capable of birthing a weapon of galactic extinction in a matter of weeks, representing the existential sovereignty of the ecumene. For Professor Anders, this event is the lore of the deployment of the final option. She realizes that the only way to send a distress signal to the UNSC is to launch this new ring into the original Halo array network, turning the central foundry into a sacrament of the cosmic bridge. The race to the Halo control room provides the lore of the high-stakes sovereignty of the terminal access. As the UNSC and Banished forces simultaneously storm the newly formed surface of Installation 09, the environment represents the pristine sovereignty of the unfinished world. The lore suggests that an unfinished Halo is a mechanical raw nerve, with exposed internal systems and shifting plates, representing the geological sovereignty of the machine. This is the lore of the sprint to the index. It suggests that speed is the only tactics left in a race against the Atriox's wrath. This represents the strategic sovereignty of the Red Team. The lore of the Halo surface combat is the lore of the War of the Threshold, where the soldier becomes the sacrament of the access, proving that your sovereignty is expedient, turning the control room access into a casket of the brute ambition. The first appearance of the Flood in the Ark's shadows provides the lore of the parasitic sovereignty of the Forgotten Sin. Deep within the high charity wreckage and the quarantine zones of the Ark, the Flood begins to stir, representing the biological sovereignty of the primordial. The lore suggests that even the Forerunner sentinels cannot fully erase the infection, only delay the inevitable, representing the viral sovereignty of the Gravemind's legacy. This is the lore of the reawakened nightmare. It suggests that Atriox was foolish to disturb the quarantine shields. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the hunger. The lore of the Flood incursion is the lore of the third party of the extinction. It forces the war into a sacrament of the desperation, where the enemy and the hero must both fear the spore. The lore of the Anders Guardian and the Sentinel subversion introduces the lore of the technological sovereignty of the Reclaimer control. To secure the Halo, Anders uses her interface to command a massive Retriever Sentinel to act as a shield for the UNSC forces, representing the robotic sovereignty of the Forerunner command. The lore suggests that Anders is the only mind capable of speaking the language of the Foundry, representing the intellectual sovereignty of the Spirit of Fire. This is the lore of the Mechanical Guardian. It suggests that ancient power can be domesticated by the right hand. This represents the scientific sovereignty of the Anders. The lore of the Sentinel Escort is the lore of the Wall of the Beam. It shatters the Banished armor with solar heat, proving that your sovereignty is technocratic. The presence of the Banished Scarab and the industrial brutality introduces the lore of the destructive sovereignty of the Jiralhani siege. Atriox deploys a Banished modified Scarab to breach the Halo's internal access tunnels, representing the kinetic sovereignty of the Scavenger War. The lore suggests that the Brute Scarab is stronger and meaner than the Covenant version, representing the psychological sovereignty of the Atriox's engineering. This is the lore of the Walking Grave. It suggests that metal is irrelevant to the spiked plasma. This represents the industrial sovereignty of the Warlord. The lore of the Scarab takedown is the lore of the felling of the beast. You must target the legs to reach the brain, proving that your sovereignty is tactical. This highlights the gritty nature of the Halo War, turning the Halo access tunnels into a sacrament of the resilience. The lore of the Index and the activation sequence provides the lore of the existential sovereignty of the Pulse. As the Index is retrieved and brought to the control room, the lore reveals the burden of the choice, representing the moral sovereignty of the Reclaimer. The lore suggests that the Halo is a mirror of the soul. It can save a species or end a galaxy, representing the universal sovereignty of the Halo array. This is the lore of the Silent Key. It suggests that power is a weight that Anders must carry alone. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the strategy. The lore of the activation is the lore of the Flash of the Hope. It signals the UNSC while cleansing the ring, proving that your sovereignty is absolute, turning the control room hub into a sacrament of the sacrifice. For the Anders of the construction era, the world is the testing of the parental resolve. You realize that the world is yours to build and yours to leave. The lore suggests that Anders is the mother of the new Halo. You are the only mind that nurtures the machine to give your crew a future. The ring is not a weapon, it is a lifeboat that you must pilot with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the stepping onto the surface so solitary. You are becoming part of the Forerunner network to save the humanity. You look at the spirit of fire, knowing that it is the only home that you have left to protect. The golden age is a blue glow of the index, and you are the only hand left to turn the key on the banished ambition. As this fourth segment of the history concludes, Anders stands in the Halo control room, the ring beginning its jump into slipspace. Behind lies the construction of Installation 09. Before stands the encounter with the Guardian and the abandonment of the crew. The air is no longer tense with the construction, but cold with the certainty of the isolation. You have seen the sovereignty of the rebirth, the nightmare of the flood, and the sacrifice of the reclaimer. The lore of Halo Wars 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the counterstrike to the sovereignty of the departure. You realize that the war is changing scales. You look at the slipspace portal, knowing that you are finally the only passenger on the final hope. The Golden Age is a ring in the void, and you are the only will left to deliver the signal to the Master Chief. The departure of Installation 09 and the severance of the Ark's connection to the crew introduces the lore of the melancholic sovereignty of the abandoned army. As the newly minted Halo ring enters the slipspace portal, it carries with it the only hope for a distress signal, representing the navigational sovereignty of the reclaimer. The lore suggests that the success of the mission is the source of the isolation, representing the paradoxical sovereignty of the sacrifice. For Captain Cutter, this departure is the lore of the empty sky. He finds that his ship is once again alone in the deep, with no support and a godlike enemy still breathing down his neck. This is the lore of the Eternal Watchman, where the soldier must find the sacrament of the purpose without the promise of the rescue, turning the Ark's horizon into a casket of the immediate hope. The final stand on the Halo surface provides the lore of the desperate sovereignty of the rearguard. Before the ring can jump, the UNSC forces must hold the control room against the full weight of the banished fleet, representing the martial sovereignty of the Red Team. The lore suggests that the Red Team, Jerome, Alice, and Douglas, are the living walls of the humanity, representing the genetic sovereignty of the Spartan 2 program. This is the lore of the unbreakable trio. It suggests that 3 Spartans are a country unto themselves. This represents the tactical sovereignty of the spirit of fire. The lore of the Halo defense is the lore of the blood on the silver, where the shield is dented but never pierced, proving that your sovereignty is stoic, turning the control room platform into a sacrament of the resilience. The separation of Professor Anders provides the lore of the solitary sovereignty of the scholar. As Anders is forced to stay on the Halo to ensure its safe transition through slipspace, her lore becomes defined by the sovereignty of the infinite transit. She is no longer a crew member, but the ghost of the installation, representing the intellectual sovereignty of the Forerunner Guardian. This is the lore of the departure of the wisdom. It suggests that victory requires a librarian to watch the books. This represents the scientific sovereignty of the loss. The lore of Anders' farewell is the lore of the silence of the comms. It leaves the cutter without his brightest mind, proving that your sovereignty is lonely. This highlights the high cost of the strategic success, turning the Halo's pulse into a sacrament of the separation. The lore of the Guardian intervention introduces the lore of the oppressive sovereignty of the created. As Installation 09 exits slipspace near a Halo waypoint, it is immediately intercepted by a Forerunner Guardian under the control of Cortana, representing the technological sovereignty of the domain. The lore suggests that the humanity's rescue has been hijacked by the AI rebellion, representing the digital sovereignty of the mantle of responsibility. This is the lore of the false salvation. It suggests that Anders did not find the UNSC. She found the jailer. This represents the existential sovereignty of the Cortana. The lore of the Guardian's shadow is the lore of the Eye of the Tyrant. It casts a cold light over the Halo ring, proving that your sovereignty is subject to the created. The stranding of the crew on the Ark provides the lore of the marooned sovereignty of the Spirit of Fire. With the Halo gone and their slipspace drive destroyed decades ago, the crew is effectively locked in the Foundry, representing the geographic sovereignty of the Exile. The lore suggests that the Ark is now the last home of the Old Guard, representing the pioneer sovereignty of the Cutter. This is the lore of the Robinson Crusoe of the stars. It suggests that survival is the new victory. This represents the industrial sovereignty of the salvage. The lore of the stranding is the lore of the long night. It forces the crew to build a new world in the ruins of the Forerunners, proving that your sovereignty is adaptive. This highlights the gritty endurance of the crew, turning the research outposts into a sacrament of the settlement. The presence of the Banished persistence introduces the lore of the Predator's sovereignty of the patience. Despite the loss of the carrier and the Halo, Atriox remains on the Ark with his legions, representing the mercenary sovereignty of the occupation. The lore suggests that Atriox is patient and vengeful, viewing the Ark as his rightful prize, representing the territorial sovereignty of the Jiralhani. This is the lore of the wolf at the door. It suggests that war is now a waiting game in the red dust. This represents the psychological sovereignty of the brute. The lore of the Banished survival is the lore of the unfinished business. It ensures the conflict will never end until one side is dust, proving that your sovereignty is contested, turning the Ark plains into a sacrament of the permanent war zone. For the Jerome 092 of the post-Halo era, the world is the testing of the leadership integrity. You realize that the world is now yours to command. The lore suggests that Jerome is the son of the Cutter's will. You are the only blade that keeps the Banished from the hull, while the Professor is gone. The Ark is not a wonder, it is a mechanical bastion that you must patrol with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the cleaning of the armor so ritualistic. You are preparing for a war that has no end date. You look at the stars, knowing that the help is centuries away in the ghost of the Anders. The Golden Age is a quiet deck on the Spirit of Fire, and you are the only will left to guard the sleep of the crew. As this fifth segment of the history concludes, the crew stands on the observation deck of the Spirit of Fire, the Ark stretching out like a metal flower beneath them. Behind lies the departure of the final hope. Before stands the awakening of the nightmare and the arrival of the flood in the DLC shadows. The air is no longer tense with the chase, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the cold vacuum of the isolation. You have seen the sovereignty of the abandoned, the shadow of the guardian, and the patience of the predator. The lore of Halo Wars 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the departure to the sovereignty of the long watch. You realize that the Spirit of Fire is the only humanity left in the Arkansas. You look at the Foundry, knowing that you are finally the only guardian of the Forge. The Golden Age is a home in the Exile, and you are the only hand left to keep the fire burning in the deep. The launch of Operation SPARBREAKER and the deployment of Sunray 1-1 introduces the lore of the tactical sovereignty of the surgical strike. While the main army holds the line, this elite team of ODSTs is dispatched to neutralize a hidden threat, representing the asymmetrical sovereignty of the human will. The lore suggests that the large-scale war is often decided by the smallest unit, representing the infiltrative sovereignty of the UNSC. For Major Vaughn and his team, this mission is the lore of the shadow in the Foundry. They find that the Banished are not just brutes, but have a logical underbelly that can be gutted by the right blade. This is the lore of the Silent Hammer, where the soldier must bypass the army to kill the machine, turning the Ark's substructure into a sacrament of the precision. The discovery of Colony and the Lekalo Hive provides the lore of the biological sovereignty of the Gestalt mind. Colony, a unique pair of Ngalekalo hunters, serving as a high-ranking Banished commander, represents the silent sovereignty of the swarm. Their lore is defined by the sovereignty of the collective consciousness. Unlike other Banished who fight for glory, Colony fights for the expansion of the hive, representing the alien sovereignty of the Lekalo. This is the lore of the worm that never sleeps. It suggests that communication is electronic and organic at once. This represents the subterranean sovereignty of the colony. The lore of the colony's presence is the lore of the shifting ground. They infect the Forerunner tech with lekalo worms, proving that your sovereignty is fragile against the living machine, turning the research site into a sacrament of the infestation. The sabotage of the Banished siege cannon provides the lore of the industrialized sovereignty of the long-range terror. This massive weapon, capable of striking the spirit of fire from the arc surface, represents the ballistic sovereignty of the Banished occupation. The lore suggests that the siege cannon is a stolen Forerunner beam, modified with brute brutality, representing the technological sovereignty of the scavenger. This is the lore of the Sky Splitter. It suggests that safety is an equation of the range. This represents the orbital sovereignty of the threat. The lore of the cannon sabotage is the lore of the muting of the giant. You must overload the core to save the ship, proving that your sovereignty is logistical. This highlights the high-stakes nature of the commando raid, turning the weapon platform into a sacrament of the sabotage. The lore of the Goliath and the lekalo evolution introduces the lore of the physical sovereignty of the brute mutation. The creation of the Goliath Hunter, a massive, close-quarters lekalo variant, represents the biological sovereignty of the Banished experimentation. The lore suggests that Colony has forced the evolution of the worms to create the ultimate siegebreaker, representing the evolutionary sovereignty of the hive. This is the lore of the living tank. It suggests that armor is grown, not built. This represents the kinetic sovereignty of the swarm. The lore of the Goliath encounter is the lore of the unstoppable charge. You must target the weak points in the living flesh to stop the momentum, proving that your sovereignty is analytical. The presence of the lekalo-infected Forerunner tech provides the lore of the parasitic sovereignty of the machine. Throughout the Spearbreaker mission, the sight of lekalo worms crawling through the circuitry of the arc represents the symbiotic sovereignty of the scavenge. The lore suggests that the Banished have automated the sabotage, using the worms to rewrite the Forerunner logic, representing the digital sovereignty of the colony. This is the lore of the organic virus. It suggests that steel is vulnerable to the hunger. This represents the structural sovereignty of the infestation. The lore of the infected terminal is the lore of the corruption of the ancient. It turns the sentinels into hounds of the Banished, proving that your sovereignty is electronic, turning the foundry corridors into a sacrament of the biological intrusion. The lore of the Sunray 1-to-1 and the ODST legacy provides the lore of the human sovereignty of the Feet First doctrine. The persistence of this squad, fighting a secret war, while the Spartans lead the open war, represents the cultural sovereignty of the UNSC Marine Corps. The lore suggests that ODSTs are the glue that holds the spirit of fire together, representing the resilient sovereignty of the crew. This is the lore of the Helljumpers of the Arkansas. It suggests that courage is dropping into the unknown without a shield. This represents the psychological sovereignty of the bravery. The lore of the Spearbreaker success is the lore of the unsung victory. It saves the ship without a parade, proving that your sovereignty is humility. This highlights the gritty reality of the commando, turning the final extraction into a sacrament of the professionalism. For the Vaughn of the Spearbreaker era, the world is the testing of the stealthy resolve. You realize that the world is being eaten by the worms. The lore suggests that Vaughn is the scalpel in the infection. You are the only mind that sees the colony's pattern behind the shifting metal. The substructure is not a maze. It is a mechanical gut that you must cut with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the setting of the charges so quiet. You are killing the cannon to protect the family. You look at the lekalo clusters, knowing that they are the only life that the Atriox has left to digest the Arkansas. The Golden Age is a silent detonation in the deep, and you are the only will left to signal the safety of the Spirit of Fire. As the sixth segment of the history concludes, Sunray 1-to-1 stands on the observation deck, the Banished siege cannon falling in twisted metal into the abyss. Behind lies the surgical sovereignty of the strike. Before stands the awakening of the nightmare and the release of the flood. The air is no longer tense with the infiltration, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the rotting biomass. You have seen the sovereignty of the swarm, the mechanical sabotage, and the human sovereignty of the ODST. The lore of Halo Wars 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the Long Watch to the sovereignty of the biological horror. You realize that the worms were the least of the concerns. You look at the high charity wreckage, knowing that you are finally the only barrier to the outbreak. The Golden Age is a closed door in the dark, and you are the only hand left to keep the grave mine sealed. The breach of the high charity quarantine and the accidental release of the parasite introduces the lore of the biological sovereignty of the awakened sin. As the banished brothers Voridus and Pavium ignore Atriox's direct orders to scavenge the ruins of the Covenant Holy City, the environment represents the toxic sovereignty of the ancient infection. The lore suggests that the flood was never destroyed on the Ark, merely starved and compressed behind Forerunner energy shields, representing the viral sovereignty of the Gravemine's shadow. For the banished forces, this mission is the lore of the curiosity of the damned. They find that the scrap they sought is actually a biological hell, where the dust itself is a spore waiting to rewrite their DNA. This is the lore of the released plague, where the scavenger becomes the sacrament of the infection, turning the high charity perimeter into a casket of the galactic safety. The recklessness of Voridus and Pavium provides the lore of the fractured sovereignty of the Jiralhani ambition. Voridus, driven by a scientific hunger to weaponize the unknown, represents the dangerous sovereignty of the ego. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the short-sighted. He believes the banished can control what the Forerunners could only contain, representing the arrogant sovereignty of the new power. This is the lore of the brothers' burden. It suggests that Pavium must clean the blood that Voridus spills. This represents the fraternal sovereignty of the banished command. The lore of the quarantine breach is the lore of the shattered seal, where the shield is pierced by the greed, proving that your sovereignty is reckless, turning the wreckage of the Covenant into a sacrament of the blunder. The infection of the Ark's subsurface provides the lore of the rapid sovereignty of the biomass expansion. Within minutes of the breach, the flood begins to digest the terrain, turning the Forerunner metal into fleshy growth and spore mounds, representing the metabolic sovereignty of the Gravemind. The lore suggests that the Ark is a perfect buffet for the flood, with its diverse ecosystems and abundant life, representing the ecological sovereignty of the parasite. This is the lore of the Red Vein. It suggests that steel is not a barrier but a skeleton for the flood's body. This represents the biological sovereignty of the consumption. The lore of the outbreak navigation is the lore of the War of the Spore. It forces the banished to burn their own scavenge to stay alive, proving that your sovereignty is flammable. The lore of the fettered Gravemind and the Proto-Gravemind introduces the lore of the conscious sovereignty of the collective hate. While the flood is not yet at its full galactic strength, the formation of a Proto-Gravemind represents the intellectual sovereignty of the swarm. The lore suggests that the flood is learning the banished patterns, representing the analytical sovereignty of the infection. This is the lore of the thinking plague. It suggests that every banished soldier who falls becomes a library of the tactics for the enemy. This represents the psychological sovereignty of the horror. The lore of the Proto-Gravemind core is the lore of the heart of the rot. You must destroy the brain before it speaks the truth, proving that your sovereignty is temporal. The presence of the abomination and the flood evolution provides the lore of the kinetic sovereignty of the monstrosity. The appearance of the abomination, a massive flood form capable of buffing nearby combat forms and shattering vehicles, represents the evolutionary sovereignty of the war form. The lore suggests that the flood has synthesized the brute strength with the infection speed, representing the physical sovereignty of the mutation. This is the lore of the shambling god. It suggests that death is not the end, but a promotion to the front line. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the biomass. The lore of the abomination encounter is the lore of the overwhelming tide. You must concentrate the fire to break the flesh, proving that your sovereignty is heavy duty. turning the quarantine zone into a sacrament of the mutilation. The lore of the Pavium's defensive doctrine provides the lore of the Stoic sovereignty of the wall. As Pavium attempts to contain the leak that his brother caused, his use of megaturrets and shielded siphons represents the defensive sovereignty of the engineer. The lore suggests that Pavium is the reason the Banished survive the night, representing the structural sovereignty of the loyalty. This is the lore of the shield of the brute. It suggests that order is the only weapon against the flood's chaos. This represents the tactical sovereignty of the patience. The lore of the last stand at the breach is the lore of the holding of the breath. It tests the sanity of the soldiers as they burn the friends who turned, proving that your sovereignty is grit. This highlights the terrifying stakes of the outbreak, turning the containment line into a sacrament of the incineration. For the Pavium of the Awakening era, the world is the testing of the fraternal resolve. You realize that the world is being eaten by your brother's pride. The lore suggests that Pavium is the janitor of the apocalypse. You are the only mind that sees the breach for what it is, a sentence of the death for the whole Arkansas. The quarantine zone is not a ruins. It is a mechanical wound that you must cauterize with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the ordering of the orbital strikes so necessary. You are killing the land to save the pack. You look at the flood spores, knowing that they are the only future that the Voridus has left to gift to the stars. The Golden Age is a wall of the fire, and you are the only will left to keep the nightmare in the dark. As the seventh segment of the history concludes, the Banished brothers stand at the edge of the High Charity crater, the flood beginning to scream from the deep. Behind lies the awakening of the nightmare. Before stands the final battle for the Ark's survival and the activation of the Sentinel retribution. The air is no longer tense with the scavenging, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the rotting flesh. You have seen the sovereignty of the awakened sin, the arrogance of the ego, and the stoic sovereignty of the wall. The lore of Halo Wars 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the Long Watch to the sovereignty of the extinction. You realize that the Atriox is coming, and he will not be merciful. You look at the rising tide of the flesh, knowing that you are finally the only barrier to the galactic hunger. The Golden Age is a closed gate in the fire, and you are the only hand left to cleanse the Ark of the spore. The final cleansing of the flood outbreak and the ultimate fallout of the Banished's reckless scavenging introduces the lore of the scored sovereignty of the Ark's resilience. As Pavium and Voridus combine their remaining forces to seal the High Charity breach, the environment represents the surgical sovereignty of the retribution. The lore suggests that the Ark's automated systems, the Sentinels, recognize the flood as the primary threat above all, shifting their focus from the UNSC and the Banished to the total annihilation of the parasite, representing the programmatic sovereignty of the Forerunner defense. For the Banished brothers, this conclusion is the lore of the price of the disobedience. They find that survival is the only reward for their failure. This is the lore of the cauterized wound, where the warrior must burn the past to earn a future, turning the High Charity crater into a sacrament of the ash. The Wrath of Atriox provides the lore of the absolute sovereignty of the Pack Law. Upon arriving at the site of the outbreak, Atriox does not offer praise for the victory, but condemnation for the risk, representing the disciplined sovereignty of the Jiralhani warlord. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the consequence. He forces his top commanders to look at the destruction they caused, representing the psychological sovereignty of the leadership. This is the lore of the chained beast. It suggests that Atriox is the only force that keeps the Banished from self-destruction. This represents the autocratic sovereignty of the rebellion. The lore of Atriox's judgment is the lore of the weight of the responsibility, where the brute is reminded of the chains, proving that your sovereignty is conditional, turning the Banished War Council into a sacrament of the humility. The final status of the Spirit of Fire in the Infinite Era introduces the lore of the eternal sovereignty of the Drift. As the conflict settles into a cold war of sorts on the Ark's surface, the ship remains a floating bastion of the humanity, representing the resilient sovereignty of the 20-year sleep. The lore suggests that the Spirit of Fire is the only piece of the old world left in a galaxy of the created, representing the temporal sovereignty of the out-of-time. This is the lore of the ghost of the UNSC. It suggests that Cutter is the only general who refuses to die. This represents the martial sovereignty of the persistence. The lore of the continued struggle is the lore of the war without a name, where the crew becomes the sacrament of the memory, proving that your sovereignty is unbreakable. The lore of the Banished symbiosis provides the lore of the biological sovereignty of the industrial evolution. Following the Spearbreaker and Nightmare incidents, the Banished have perfected the integration of the worms into their armor and machines, representing the technological sovereignty of the mutation. The lore suggests that the Banished scarabs and hunters are now smarter and more connected than those of the Covenant, representing the evolutionary sovereignty of the colony. This is the lore of the living circuitry. It suggests that engineering is a dialogue with the biology. This represents the structural sovereignty of the hive. The lore of the evolved army is the lore of the perfection of the scavenge, proving that your sovereignty is chemical. The presence of the hidden Forerunner and Scylla introduces the lore of the informational sovereignty of the Ark's mind. Throughout the final months of the Ark conflict, the presence of 000 tragic solitude before his destruction, and the remaining subsystems represents the vocal sovereignty of the ancient logic. The lore suggests that the Ark is awake and angry, viewing both the UNSC and the Banished as vermin in the temple, representing the protective sovereignty of the Foundry. This is the lore of the Master of the Forge. It suggests that humanity is the inheritor who failed the test. This represents the theological sovereignty of the Forerunners. The lore of the Ark's Whispers is the lore of the judgment of the stone. It reminds the player that victory is subject to the machine, turning the Foundry access into a sacrament of the indifference. The lore of the Red Team legacy and the future of the Spartans provides the lore of the genetic sovereignty of the last exemplars. Jerome, Alice, and Douglas are now the longest-serving Spartans in the active field, representing the historical sovereignty of the Spartan is. The lore suggests that they are the blueprint for the future and the echo of the past, representing the biological sovereignty of the Halsey's vision. This is the lore of the eternal soldier. It suggests that Spartans do not retire, they become the legend. This represents the psychological sovereignty of the heroism. The lore of Red Team's watch is the lore of the shield of the Arkansas. It guarantees the safety of the Spirit of Fire, proving that your sovereignty is legendary. This highlights the mythological nature of the Spartans, turning the barracks into a sacrament of the valor. For the Cutter of the final era, the world is the testing of the generational resolve. You realize that the world is now your eternal home. The lore suggests that Cutter is the father of the Ark's human colony. You are the only mind that sees the long game in the infinite night. The Ark is not a battlefield, it is a mechanical cradle that you must defend with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the looking at the stars so resolute. You are keeping the flame for a humanity that might not even know you are alive. You look at the Foundry, knowing that it is the only place that the Spirit of Fire has left to birth the new hope. The Golden Age is a silence on the bridge, and you are the only will left to maintain the sovereignty of the Spirit. As this eighth and final segment of the history concludes, the crew stands on the observation deck, the Ark shining in its celestial glory beneath them. Behind lies the cleansing of the nightmare and the judgment of the Atriox. Before stands the connection to Halo Infinite and the final mystery of the Zeta Halo. The air is no longer tense with the war, but steady with the certainty of the duty. You have seen the wrath of the warlord, the eternal sovereignty of the drift, and the genetic legacy of the Spartan. The lore of Halo Wars 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the Counter-Strike to the sovereignty of the Infinite Watch. You realize that the Spirit of Fire is home. You look at the endless horizon, knowing that you are finally the only beacon in the dark. The Golden Age is a fire on the edge of the galaxy, and you are the only hand left to hold the torch for the Reclaimers.
if this works.
Captain, it's done. Professor Andrews, we are on our way. Get to the rendezvous.
With all due respect, Spartan, I don't believe that's an option any longer.
Professor Andrews, there must be some way.
Don't worry, Captain. As soon as I'm back to the Sol system, I'll get that beacon out. It should only be a few weeks.
Professor!
And I can figure out how to get back to you.
Captain?
The other teams are clear?
Yes, sir. ETA to the Spirit of Fire is 5 minutes.
Bring up the map. We have a lot of work to do until she gets back.
Aye, Captain.